Welcome to SheVentures. I'm Doria, co-founder of CentSai. Listen to women who take risks, build community, and get shit done. Recording from Madison Avenue in New York City. Today's show is brought to you by Audible. Audible is offering our listeners a free audiobook with a 30-day trial membership. Just go to audibletrial.com/SheVentures and browse the unmatched selection of audio programs. Download a title free and start listening. It's that easy. Go to audibletrial.com/SheVentures to get started today. What does financial literacy mean to the LGBTQ plus community? And are there specific issues this group faces when it comes to money, life, love, and identity? Let's face it, we've all seen shows like Modern Family, Will and Grace, and countless other pop culture stereotypes of the LGBTQ plus or queer lifestyle. The financial reality can be starker for many. The money coach who we'll be speaking with today will help us break down some of those stereotypes and help us understand the hidden costs of being gay. Cait Howerton, welcome to SheVentures.
Hey, thanks so much for having me.
It's a pleasure to have you. And it's very eye-opening for me because when we initially connected, one of the topics that you had mentioned and what we're going to be talking a lot about today are the hidden costs of being gay. And I think it's something that, while as a society, in some ways we feel we've made progress, I think that there's so much more to learn about this topic, and I can't wait to delve into it.
Sure.
I wanted to start out by letting our listeners learn a little bit about you. You grew up in Central Arkansas. You were a first-generation college student. You received a fully funded scholarship. You earned your MBA by the time you were 24, and you also came out your first semester in college. Can you think back and describe that process for you?
Yeah, actually coming out was more of thrown out. So, for me growing up in Central Arkansas, it was being, LGBTQ or just kind of like that operational definition, the academic kind of definition of being within the queer community. It wasn't something that I grew up with really being exposed to. I knew that I was different and that I was like, well, I don't really like guys, but I suppose I'll try to date them because that's what I'm supposed to be doing. So yeah, I received a call from home. They had found out, that I was coming out in college. I wasn't quite ready to have those conversations yet. So from there, it really was an impact on my overall 20s. I would say losing that safe connection and feeling like, for me, if for lack of better words, kind of like a golden child of just doing everything correct. And then experiencing a lot of animosity and angst and tension within my family. It was very difficult.
So they knew you as Cait, the young woman who works hard, gets a scholarship, and for some reason, the fact that you came out as gay just went against that view of you.
Yeah, I think parents have a certain expectation of who their children are going to become. And I think that's really, really difficult to kind of not imagine that, to imagine our little boys or our little girls becoming a particular thing as they evolve and grow. And we have hopes and dreams for them being our children. And so I think it's one of those, for when I did come out, I think that they had this ideal of who I was, and I kind of shattered that ideal. And in the process, it was grieving for my family. And in a lot of ways, I think it was primarily fear, of did we fail? Did we do something wrong?
And coming back full circle to today, has that relationship been repaired?
Yeah, I think in some ways it will always be a lasting impact. It's something that how that evolved and me feeling quite a bit different than my family has certainly been something that I've worked on. Quite a bit of therapy through most of my middle 20s into my late 20s to help mend those wounds, as well as conversations with parents and family members and so forth. I would say that it's a world above where it was.
I think for many families, right, we don't get to choose our family. And so I think that says a lot. You had mentioned also that throughout your 20s, you lived in 4 different cities. You became a first-time homeowner as a single woman. And you mentioned something that was interesting to me that I know anecdotally being true, living in New York City, that the queer community in general tends to live in costlier metropolitan areas, or at least you did, because there's a more progressive ideology. In relationship to that, you had also said in regards to yourself that, and you kind of alluded to this, in your 20s, you had to sever relationships, which also had an economic impact on you. And you had to move to these more inclusive, expensive areas or cities. And so I wanted you to walk us through that a little bit.
There are many parts of the United States that are welcoming to the LGBT community, but unfortunately, most of these areas really come with a higher price tag. So 44% of the LGBT population live in states that do not prohibit employment discrimination based upon sexual orientation or gender identity. And unfortunately, most of these states that do prohibit employment discrimination have costs of living well above the national average. So states with the lowest living costs, such as West Virginia and Arkansas, they are 17% below the national average, whereas among the others that actually have some protections, they're quite a bit more expensive.
Exactly. You had mentioned that there were other hidden costs that the LGBTQ plus community face. Can you mention what some of those are?
Sure. I guess so. Going personally, get back to the question about location and living. For me, I was raised in a very, very large family and community of people who really, if something were to happen, if there were a funeral, people are showing up with like 1,000 lasagnas and helping you through not just that week, but then in the coming weeks. My parents, they built their own home, and I remember they had many, many Saturdays where friends and family were coming to help actually work on this house with them. So it's one of those, I think we underestimate the value of community, not just on our mental health, but also on helping raise our children, the costs that we save for babysitters and for overall just help with our lives. So whether it's, hey, I need a plumber, and someone down the road, if you will, is a plumber or an electrician, et cetera, and they're able to help you with that. So that barter system and community and friendship is, once you leave, you have to develop those relationships again. And as we all probably know, adult friendships and forging community, it's pretty tough, especially in areas that are fairly transient.
True. I was thinking, do you think that within the LGBTQ plus community that there is that ability to have a bartering system amongst yourselves and support each other?
Absolutely. So, that is something that I have found along the way through friendships that I have made. My chiropractor is one of my great friends. I have friends who are accountants and friends who are other, within other services that we help one another out. So even within my own personal life as a financial coach and forging financial planner, I have friends that are therapists that guide me through some of their own theory and their own practices of, hey, this is a different way to say this, or these are things that you can do in return for, let me talk to you about your student loans and how you get those paid off. So I think that we do develop these communities. I think that some of the limitations come with that is that once we have lost that primary attachment to our family, especially at a fairly young age, we lose a lot of confidence in ourselves. And so there's actually kind of a term of like a second puberty within the LGBT community, because for so many, they didn't experience dating and teenage years the same way that maybe people that are heterosexual did. And so you're having to kind of start over and figure out who you are and regain confidence within yourself. And so in some ways that can also impact your community building skills. So there are pros of forging alliances and friendships, but there's also some cons that you're having to overcome just that internal shame and doubt and find who you are, even despite the experiences that might have happened earlier in life.
I was thinking about that and also thinking about a survey that Mass Mutual did in 2017 that found that among queer people, debt and lower income are their two biggest struggles. And what I wondered in relationship to what you're saying about second puberty or about, having low self-esteem or the various things that happen as a result of being broken from your family, not by your own choosing. How do you think that the queer lifestyle or the decision of your families to not be a part of your life, how does that play into these two issues of debt and lower income specifically?
I think that really shows, or that really kind of reflects some of the things that we learn about within trauma-informed practices. So it's kind of not necessarily what is wrong with you, but what has happened to you. So when we think about children who have lower adverse childhood events, they typically are able to forge healthy relationships. They have parents who kind of guide them, hopefully, out of the nest into life. And when we have these healthy relationships and have supportive home lives, typically along the way, we learn at least something about money. And even if we aren't taught it, we are given some sort of resource of helping us transition from being high schoolers, that 18 years old who one minute they have to ask to go use the restroom and the next minute they're in college making these decisions on their own, excuse me.
Yeah, I was going to say, thinking to my own children who are not quite that age, but it's like one minute they, need a lot of hand holding, the next they're totally independent. It's a really interesting dichotomy.
It truly is. Yeah, it really, really is. And so typically, if we are coming from healthy and loving backgrounds, we have families that are able to help guide us through these things. And so whether it's learning how to budget, opening a checking account, understanding the implications of credit cards, understanding what a credit score is and how, because 18 to 22-year-olds are absolutely flooded or were prior to, to new legislation or flooded with offers for credit cards. After the recession, there was quite a bit of overall legislation that has prevented some of that. So, but nonetheless, we start making really poor decisions at a young age that can follow us well through our 20s and 30s that put us off to a bad start. But on top of that, LGBT young people and the children of LGBT parents are more likely to perform poorly in school, face those challenges of post-secondary education. So that impacts their earnings over time, which then can lead to the usage of debt to make ends meet. And then, also it's been shown that children who are LGBT and especially transgendered individuals are far more likely to be homeless, to actually be kicked out of their homes at 16, 15, 17 years old, simply because of who they love. So long term, that has a lot of implications on debt and where they wind up financially.
The thought of kicking out a child for any reason is so upsetting to me. And to think that there are adolescents out there that are struggling as a result of who they are. If someone wanted to help, if one of our listeners wants to help, is there something that he or she could do?
Yeah, absolutely. So the first organization that comes to mind is PFLAG. So I believe it's parents and families. It may be parents and friends of lesbians and gays. That's also inclusive to transgender individuals. So that organization truly helps parents understand what it means for their child to be gay. It also helps with transitioning through that process of coming out and understanding for yourself as an individual what it is to be gay. But within each community, there are countless resources that someone can just literally, like Seattle, resources for LGBTQ plus. I would start there of just really seeing what can you do even at a micro level, or even if it's just within your local communities at the post-secondary level, starting diversity programs and having these conversations with one another. Oftentimes we forget that the change that we can produce by simply just creating that ripple effect of having conversations with people that we love and care about in ways that bridge the divide. We obviously kind of, our nation right now is very, very divided over core issues, but for the most part, we all have so much in common. There's not a single human being that we can't find a commonality with. It just takes the courage and bravery to have these conversations.
I love that. Courage and bravery. And those are two things that I think are missing in our current leadership, sadly. But I try to be apolitical on this podcast, but it's hard for me to sometimes. So, in regards to this study, it also found that 1 in 3 queer workers say that spending money to enjoy themselves today is more important than saving for the future. Compared to the general population, it was 36 to 27%. What do you think fuels that stat?
I think it's probably really important that we realize the impacts of AIDS and HIV within the gay community. So that is not typically, that is a little more pervasive within the gay community versus the overall LGBTQ community. But at one point, their life duration, their life expectancy was quite a bit shorter. So, for not to be a stereotypical millennial, but YOLO really meant it was very, very active within their lives because truly they only have today to live. Fortunately, with advances of medicine and with increased just advocacy and awareness of HIV and AIDS prevention, we're, of course, seeing that being less and less of a risk for men within the gay community that they're facing. So now they're able to plan longer, to be able to start looking at retirement planning, et cetera. But likewise, I think it's also incredibly important to remember that marriage equality was only passed in June 2015. It hasn't even been a full 4 years yet. So thinking about that, that's not even a college degree of how long it's been since my marriage would be legal. So there are so many things that come with, if I were to be married and I died, my wealth and everything that I'm building wouldn't even necessarily pass on to my wife. It would go to my estate, or it would be so many complications of attorneys and wills and, power of attorney and et cetera, et cetera. And so it becomes all right, why do I even need to plan for tomorrow? Because if I can't even leave this to her, or if it's just going to be disputed, or if she can't even be in the hospital room with me as I'm dying, why does this money even matter? So I think that really goes back to, not to bring in too much psychology, but to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. If our general needs are not being met for safety and housing and food and so on and so forth, and love and belonging, it really becomes difficult to make it up the ladder to that self-actualization point because these primary needs aren't being addressed.
You make me think back to a conversation that I had with my daughter because I take it for granted. I was in college in the 90s, and I remember when AIDS initially came out, it was known as GRID, or gay-related immunodeficiency disease, because all they knew was that it was affecting gay men. And I also remember that it was a death sentence, and no one understood at that time. I mean, they over time understood what was going on, but the fact that people today, gay men or women for that matter, anyone who is HIV plus, can live a longer life is a huge shift in the last 20 years that I think many people aren't even aware of.
Yeah, no, I wholeheartedly agree.
And it also, not to bring pop culture into this again, but have you seen Bohemian Rhapsody?
I have not. I'm unfortunately amidst the CFP program right now. So my life kind of consists of studying and living and breathing personal finance, but I have heard that it is very, very good. And of course, having some awareness of the band in itself and of that pop history.
It's an incredible movie. And if you are able to take a little time off from studying, I know what that's like. Doing a startup and working 16-hour days, I totally get it. I would really recommend it. One of the things that I learned that I did not realize was that Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, you alluded to this before, it doesn't explicitly include sexual orientation or gender identity. So state laws vary. The 2017 stats that I found said that in 28 states, you could potentially get fired based on your sexual orientation. In 30 states, you could be fired for being transgender. And in 22 states and the District of Columbia, they prohibit any kind of employment discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity by statute. So it really is something that affects the queer community in the workplace in a very profound way. And you had mentioned that you yourself have lost jobs as a result of being gay. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So fortunately, I did not lose. I lost a job offer. It wasn't actually the job. So 20% of LGBTQ plus Americans have experienced discrimination based on sexual orientation or gender identity when applying for jobs or when hired. And like you had mentioned, at the state level versus at the federal level protections, and because of Title VII. So what that means is, and I will come back to the answer on my personal experiences of this, but I have a friend who's transgender who's literally lost 8 jobs because she's trans.
How does that go down?
There's, with so many at-will employment states, it's very easy. You can come up with something else to say this or that. But when it's fairly evident, you can see, just depending upon whatever it is, if it's someone has personally expressed a bias to whether it's just within their language, whether it's within finding kind of nitpicking things to be able to document on your record that aren't being addressed with other employees, really targeting one particular person, that it feels like there's a target on your back. And I think it really just depends upon the individual. And even for her, it was different reasonings for every single time. But for a lot of LGBTQ people, it is a threat to bring a picture of their partner to set it on their desk at work. They won't talk about who they're dating or who they're married to, just simply out of fear. I have worked with clients that a couple of mine ended up getting married in their 50s, and they wouldn't even talk about it, even with almost being 4 years after marriage equality has been passed, about getting married, because out of fear of their jobs and fear of their community. They reside in Alabama. So there's still a lot of rampant fear, even despite marriage equality having been passed, because there's so many other laws that are lacking that protection for our livelihood. But as far as me personally, I actually have interviewed for positions that came in. I was 100% qualified, even at times have been overqualified. And I've had a financial planner tell me when I was interviewing for a paraplanner position of, I love your spirit and your passion, and I love your background. However, I don't know that you will resonate with my clients. And so when I kind of explored, what does that mean? Well, they're older, kind of baby boomers, and I just don't know that you would enjoy working with them. So it's fairly apparent. I don't think that you'll resonate with my clients. And it's something that people within our community are facing every single day.
Right. And I think that's what makes it so difficult, is that what you just said, could be argued to be meant something else, but being the person having listened to it, being there in the moment, you knew full well what it meant. And I think that that's often true about the subtlety of any kind of discrimination in the workplace. Sometimes it's not so subtle. It's how it's said and the fear that it causes that really limits people from reaching their full potential.
Yeah, wholeheartedly. And that's kind of the unfortunate thing about, microaggressions versus macroaggressions, is it's very difficult to be able to say, yeah, no, this is full on discrimination. But when we aren't a victim of oppression, it's hard for us to identify, or even to be able to empathize with someone who has experienced these things over and over and over and over. But I think by stepping back and really challenging, even for me within the LGBT community, to challenge my subconscious biases, we're programmed every single day to be able to think a particular way. And it takes challenging these things and living a life of self-examination to make sure that we truly are being inclusive and understanding the plights of other people.
Right, which it's so true that if you don't stand in someone else's shoes, it's so hard to know what they're going through. And having that ability to at least be aware that they have their own issues to grapple with, regardless of who they are. I was wondering, from a leadership perspective in organizations, what can people do to help? Because it's one thing to say, okay, we're going to set an HR policy about X, Y, and Z. I don't know how effective that really is. And so I was just curious what your thoughts are in terms of making sure that queer employees are supported and not put in a position where they are fearful in an office environment?
For me, with being in the financial services industry, and especially for within the financial planning industry, there are 23% of financial planners are female. And of that 23%, it has been stagnant at that overall distribution of female planners to male planners for many years. And so the CFP board has kind of taken it on as one of their missions, if you will, for lack of better words, to address this issue of distribution and presence of female planners within the industry. So I think first conducting research, and if we don't if an organization does not have the means to conduct research, there is a lot of great research out there that's available to the HR community to be able to be aware of truly the discrimination that is happening. So first, awareness. Second, I would say to be able to actually address the way that job descriptions are being posted, making sure that they are not using language that is going to turn female and LGBTQ applicants away from applying. So that's going to be primarily very masculine-based language, actually incorporating some soft skill verbiage and addressing emotional intelligence within their applications as well. So many studies have been done to show that men who are not qualified for a position who will be more apt to apply versus women who are actually qualified. If there's one thing on there that shows, well, maybe I wouldn't be a good fit, they're not going to. So that's probably the first step. Second, making it an objective key result for identifying what is the distribution of female to male applicants for every position within our company. And are we doing a good job of starting from the very beginning of that bucket of obtaining applicants, and then also making sure that we are screening applicants as well, that we're making sure that we have an equal distribution of men to women and also LGBTQ individuals. That is very difficult within the hiring process because it's kind of an invisible hand. You don't really know if someone is or is not gay, straight, bisexual, transgender, etc. But next, having policies to where you have an ear to your supervisor. You have a line to your supervisor, having peer-to-peer reviews, anonymous peer-to-peer reviews, so that people know that there's not an employee just being effective and getting promoted, but they also have truly poor interactions with their coworkers. Or that they're even resulting in discrimination, bullying, et cetera, within the workplace. So I would say creating a culture of transparency and continual communication is key. And then lastly, putting that within your values and in your mission statements and making that to be something that's at the forefront of your horizon and where you're heading as an organization, that look, we are a diverse organization and we do not tolerate this kind of behavior and treatment of other people. But that really has to start with the leadership, and it has to start with a brave stance. It's going back to that bravery and that courage, is that you have to be someone who leads with integrity and is willing to say, this isn't right. So it really starts there. If you have to be able to check your values, and if you don't take a stance on something, you're siding with the side of an oppressor, because doing nothing is actually doing something.
I could not agree more with that statement. I think oftentimes I've heard this, and I view it as an excuse many times, where it said, I didn't want to get involved, I wasn't sure what to do, etc. But actually, people do know when something feels wrong or doesn't, it just isn't on the up and up. And I completely agree with you on the culture of transparency. I was wondering, as far as when you talk about soft skills in an application, can you give some examples of what those might be?
Sure. Yeah. So when I think about soft skills, I think about, especially within my role in my field, we actually put it within our application, or our job description, is high levels of empathy, conflict resolution, and difficult conversation, something along the lines of, having the ability to forge relationships with team members, to be able to work cohesively with one another, to be able to have difficult conversations that result in the collaboration of teams and the forward motion of the organization. So things that maybe aren't advanced in Excel, or having 6 years experience of working with hedge funds, so on and so forth. It's actually some of these interpersonal skills and having skills within effective communication, and so forth, that by putting those as be just as important as maybe your math abilities or your sales abilities, your closing rates, etc., I think that will attract more applicants who feel like, okay, who I am and some of these things that I also bring to the table are just as valuable. And in my experience with working with clients and also working with a startup and a leadership team, that they're as much, if not more important than some of the hard skills.
I completely agree. And I didn't realize that the CFP board is making an effort to address this, because I will say from my perspective, when I think about big financial firms, I think about the most important thing is how many assets under management are you able to bring in, or some kind of hard number or hard sell. And that doesn't not only work with the queer community, I think it doesn't work with millennials. I don't think it's going to work with Gen Z. And I think there's a real disconnect between financial institutions in general and the up and coming people who are going to be inheriting $30 trillion, over the course of the next, I don't know how many years. What are your thoughts on that?
We've seen our administrations going back and forth on a fiduciary responsibility within the financial services industry. And we went from more of a Democratic Congress to now more of a Republican Congress. And some of the fiduciary standards that were passed by the Department of Labor have now since been rolled back. But there's this tension within the financial services community of what is it mean to be a fiduciary. So just in layman's terms, that essentially means that you are putting your client's best interests first at all times. And so there is a huge movement within how financial planners are being paid, whether that's a commission-based from a fee-only standpoint, which is kind of what you mentioned a moment ago, maybe assets under management, as well as within that fee-only realm or umbrella, we're also starting to see more of a subscription-based model evolving to where you're simply paying for financial planning, but it's simply just for the advice versus bringing all of your assets to me and having an asset limit to where before you have to have so much in net worth before I will work with you.
Mm-hmm.
To where I don't want to say the Netflix of financial planning, but somewhat of that, to where you're paying it for it on a monthly basis or a quarterly basis to speak with someone who has this knowledge that will help you guide your financial future.
I think what you're describing is so much more of a holistic approach to financial planning, because it reminds me of someone that I had on a previous podcast who's also a money coach now. She was an Olympian. And one of the things that happened to her in her earlier life was she got an endorsement deal. A financial planner told her that she actually could afford a certain size house, which really wasn't in her best interest. Also sold her a life insurance policy, which was, in her view, in hindsight, far less important than paying off her student debt. And so I think that if I'm understanding you, prioritizing and understanding what your clients' needs are from a financial perspective and responding to those.
Absolutely. There's quite a bit of not so great intention around working with a client when for what's the financial planner's best interest is to make a life insurance policy sell or to obtain those assets and to be able to make trades and so forth so that they're receiving front end or back end commissions or receiving the commissions off of a life insurance policy. We're far more apt to make these suggestions to our clients if that means that is our livelihood and that means that we are progressing our overall salary on a yearly basis. So like you said, with looking at financial planning in a holistic way, I really do see the financial planning industry is starting to morph and evolve to be able to consider the client's best interest. And what you just said is, what is my priority as a client? Where do I want to go? What do I need to do? And actually considering those best interests as a financial planner, I think 5 to 10 years from now, this service will look completely different. There's quite a few organizations right now that actually are coming together to bring awareness of fiduciary standard and acting on your client's behalf versus just simply acting for the benefit of a dollar.
And right now, correct me if I'm wrong, the political stance has been to kind of move away from that. Is that correct?
That's right. We went through several years of our administration looking at instituting. They had instituted actually a fiduciary ruling, the Department of Labor, in our previous administration. And then in our current administration, they kind of went back and rolled that back. So, and changed terms and so forth. So we were moving in a positive direction, and then one step forward, two steps back. I think that we will continue to see this being brought up more and more.
I think so too. Also, because I think fintechs are putting a lot of pressure on traditional financial institutions, where one of the things that you said really resonated with me. There used to be, it was very commonplace that a financial planner would say to you, you need X amount of money before I'll even work with you. And you have things like Stash and other products that are, coming up that don't require that same amount of money. You can even, put cents on the dollar in over time, and that's still saving.
Yeah, absolutely.
Going back to your clients, who I don't want to assume are all from the queer community, but getting back to what's affecting the queer community specifically from a financial standpoint, what would you say are the top 3 issues that you see within your own practice?
Number one, the thing that affects the queer community most would be initially straight out the jump of that acceptance or discarding by their family. I think that that's going to have probably the biggest hit on them initially. 40% of homeless youth are LGBT, and 29% of transgender individuals live in poverty. So I think that we have to start there developmentally to look at where are we beginning this race? Because if we're starting the race of life financially behind or in the negative, it's very, very difficult to get caught back up. So number one, having familial support and general access to financial literacy, whether that be through school or at home. Number two, I would say protection at the micro and state level of sexual orientation and gender. To be able to be protected by these things means that we have safety in our jobs. There are a few aspects of our lives that touch every single part of what we do and who we are, and one of those is money. Without having a safe and stable job, it's really difficult to move forward with debt payoff, with building our credit, with acquiring wealth, with becoming first-time homeowners, etc. And then third, I would probably say would be as far as issues that affect the LGBTQ community in particular, it would be a tough tie between the wage gap and the cost of becoming a parent. So the gender and racial wage gap it's going to show that it's going to disproportionately affect lesbian couples and people of color. So, if you're a lesbian couple, you have twice the opportunity or chance for the impact of the wage gap to affect you. Triple if both are women or, both are women of color, or even just one being a person of color within that relationship. We see that kind of every single day as all women are trying to break that glass ceiling.
Absolutely.
And then just the other part of that being parenthood. I would say that parenthood's probably number 4, but it is something that affects LGBTQ people at a disproportionate rate comparative to, heterosexual individuals.
Why do you think that is?
Well, traditional methods of conception are not an option for LGBT individuals. So we have to pursue adoptions, potentially in vitro fertilization or surrogacy, to be able to have a child. Adoptions are really for anyone, not just the LGBTQ individuals, but they're $5,000 to $40,000. Adoption is very, very difficult in this nation. But on top of that, an LGBTQ individual has to go through second parent adoption processes as well. That's another $2,000 to $3,000 coupled with wills and, powers of attorney and so forth. So to give you kind of an example of that, if my partner and I get married and she carries, so if we elect to simply have her to be the donor, so not to go through IVF to where she would carry an embryo of my own, just for her to be able to carry. When she gives birth, even if we're married, I then have to go through the state and petition to become a second parent, and I have to pay for a second parent adoption of that child. I can be listed on the birth certificate. I can be married to the child's mother, and that still does not make me a parent.
Is that true across the country? I didn't realize this.
It is. It is. I mean, I know that there are advancements within states as they're progressing, but overall, because of state to state regulations, we're still at a point to where individuals have to go through that second parent adoption because there's so much that can happen if you being married, if my partner and I, like I said, for her to carry the child and we are to divorce, I don't truly have any parentage rights over the child without that second parent adoption.
Right. I guess I can understand that, but at the same time, it certainly complicates the situation. And then gay men, I have a friend who had a surrogate have his daughter. And so those are also huge costs as well.
Yeah, that cost can go as much as $150,000. I mean, there's a lot that comes with that, the cost of carrying and the medical procedures, so on and so forth. But on top of that, you have to have fairly extenuous legal protections when you are using a surrogate.
Right. Because the person can, I guess, change her mind, or what are the other issues that might surface?
Yeah. I mean, so, medical insurance for the surrogate, as well as there are carrying rights that a surrogate mother retains. So it becomes very complicated. I won't speak to that too much in depth because with me not being an attorney and also things varying from state to state, I would hate to give poor advice. But primarily from my understanding, like you said, a mother can change her mind. And you have to have those protections of if I spend this money, what happens then? So does that simply result in a loss of money? Will I get this money back, et cetera?
Right. And the stress for all individuals around, right?
Mm-hmm.
One of the other issues that I wanted to touch on, and it's something that you brought up in your own story, and it's something I think that's been a theme throughout our conversation about loss of family. Obviously mental health plays a huge role in everyone's life. And I was really shocked when I was doing research for this podcast to realize that the World Health Organization didn't declassify transgender as a mental disorder until last year, 2018.
Yeah, that's right.
That's incredible and shocking to me. So when I delved into it a little bit more, I also learned that LGBTQ plus individuals are almost 3 times more likely than others to have mental health conditions, such as major depression or generalized anxiety disorder. And a lot of that, as you alluded to before, might be because of the fear of coming out and being discriminated against. And, that can lead to depression, post-traumatic stress, etc. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your experience in this regard and how you think it affects queer people in general financially.
Yeah, absolutely. So I would have to probably reference attachment theory to be able to discuss this in an academic and informed manner. So attachment theory essentially states that our attachment bonds start as soon as we are born, especially within like the first 0 to 2 years old. It influences our relationships with our parents and so forth, and kind of how we attach and relate to other people. But there are attachment wounds that can happen throughout our childhood. And that can even stretch really well into about our mid-20s, being that our prefrontal cortex isn't fully developed until about 25. So a big attachment wounding result in a loss of security with our families, with our primary attachment partners. And so until we pair with someone else, I know this is all very psychological verbiage and so forth, but until we actually evolve and grow up and start to date and marry and so forth, we find that safety in our parents and in our home and in our communities. And so when something happens, it can create an overall loss of identity, of self-confidence, of awareness and safety of the world, awareness within our bodies. It presents a lot of issues that come up from that safety that we have at home, such as anxiety, depression, just so many things that can happen with our overall feelings of belonging and that we are okay. Brene Brown talks about guilt is that I have done something bad versus shame is that I am bad. And so hearing a continual message from the people that we think that we've grown up to think that these people are supposed to love us. If they don't love us, who will? It starts to impact in such a way that, going back to that ripple effect, that it just fans out to where we lose our complete confidence in who we are as individuals and where we fit in our workplaces, in our schools, in our friendships. And you have to overcome that. And you have to go back to that messaging and to be able to explore within our development that we are okay, that we as people who are within the LGBT community, it's okay that as to who we are. Other people may not accept us or be fearful of, who we are, but that doesn't negate our overall dignity.
And in that process, it's a very, I think, painful process that can happen for a variety of reasons. Child abuse might be another one. And then coming out of it and figuring out, okay, actually, it was my caregivers, not me. How do you see that, or can you speak to how that affects someone's ability to earn moving forward? Because you're grappling with these other issues.
Wholeheartedly. I think about within my first year of college, I was a 4.2 student from high school. I finished high school being very, very well accomplished and as an honors graduate. In my first semester, when I came out, I had 2 C's on my transcript. And it was completely unlike who I was as a student. I wasn't able to find myself within where I was and to be able to focus on my learning and my moving forward as a student and a professional. I think what it can result in is a lot of pairing in unhealthy relationships, whether this is LGBTQ individuals who've gone through kind of adverse childhood events and some attachment woundings, or just anyone, like you said, anyone who's faced childhood abuse, emotional abuse, so on and so forth. I think that we start trying to fill these holes like a patchwork quilt of whether it's someone else, an unhealthy relationship, if it's drinking, if it's turning to drugs, if it's simply just an overall depression and we lose our lack of motivation and drive, if it's anxiety to where we're pushing ourselves to either kind of one way or the other, whether it be workaholism and we're trying to excel and exceed and we push our bodies into shutdown, or the other way to where we're paralyzed with anxiety and we just can't perform in the ways that we need to. So all of these things, as you kind of see through this picture that I've just painted, they start to snowball. If you aren't able to be your best at work, if you have anxiety or depression or fears that are cropping up that are keeping you from sleeping, you're not able to get out of bed to work out and take care of yourself. If you then are finding unhealthy relationships to fill voids that you once had with having healthy relationships with family and friends, you start to, one decision, one choice, one next step starts to compound. And before you know it, you're not as successful within your education. You are not networking. You're not going out to get the jobs that maybe you could have if you hadn't have had something happen along the way. Or maybe you are landing the job and you're not able to get out of bed for days or weeks at a time with depression. Or even if you're going through a series of tumultuous relationships, which results in moving a lot or, recouping costs with if you're moving in and out of relationships and actually cohabitating or getting married and divorcing, it just results in a very volatile home life to where it kind of just is a series of events on top of the other.
It makes perfect sense to me. I wonder, are there any organizations in regards to mental health that you wanted to recommend to any listeners who might be grappling with this in the queer community specifically?
Yeah, so I would say for me, the organization that has made the biggest difference overall would be the Emotionally Focused Therapy community. And that can be found through ICE EFT. You can just kind of search that online. NAMI, the National Alliance for Mental Illness. They have a lot of resources for individuals who were within the LGBT community. Like I said, PFLAG earlier. And there are other countless resources that someone can find online when they start to look for LGBTQ resources within their mental health.
These are great recommendations. One of the things that you said is, I have learned that showing up wholeheartedly is the antithesis of weakness. It is the greatest test of strength that one can encounter. I have taken my quote unquote mess and have reframed it to be my message for others. Can you talk to me a little bit about that?
Yeah. So for me, at one point, I was like, where do I belong? Where do I fit? I'm so different from everyone that I grew up with and from my family. And what's wrong with me? What's wrong with me? What's wrong with me? What's wrong with me? That's kind of the thing that would course through my mind. I would navigate social situations, familial situations, etc. I walk into a room and people immediately know that I'm a lesbian, something that I don't have. I can't really conceal that. And so the fear of simply existing was with me at all points. And so I have been able to overcome the messages that I have received subliminally through microaggressions, outright, through rejection, and to find within myself, yeah, man, you're okay. You're good. Like, show up and be you, because people will resonate with you and people will be able to see that you can have resiliency and to overcome really a heck of a lot. So I have been able to, with a lot of self-work and a lot of therapeutic work, overcome those things. Not completely, but I want to show up for my clients, whether LGBTQ or not, and just to kind of let them know that, hey, you're all right. We're going to figure this out. We're going to figure out your money. We'll figure out what's going on within your life personally. And it happened. Let's be aware of it. And then also let's figure out a strategy to move forward so that you really can achieve your goals in life. So for me, that's my mess is now my message of show up and be authentic, be yourself. And you may piss people off along the way, but you're also going to resonate with a hell of a lot.
I love that. And I think this is a perfect place to end our conversation. I want to thank you so much for speaking with me today. I think this has been incredibly educational, and I am very grateful for your time.
Of course. Yeah. Thank you.
You've been listening to SheVentures. Like what you heard? You can find us wherever you get your podcasts. Be sure to subscribe and sign up for our newsletter so you never miss a show.